Hi, guys. You're all set.
So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I am live in Brooklyn in the Williamsburg neighborhood. So I'm hoping the music isn't going to be too annoying. I might mute myself so when I'm not talking. So hopefully everybody's read the book at some time or another. It's kind of a book that you read and go back to. And we have a special guest. We have Mitchell Nathanson. Mitch, I think you're on mute. So we'd like to start with you if that's okay. And we don't want to take too much of your time.
Yeah, sure.
So Mitchell, just to introduce him, he's a professor of law at Villanova. Is it in Philadelphia?
Well, it's outside of Philadelphia, in Villanova. But,
okay.
You know, close enough.
Okay, close enough. I haven't been there. I've been to Philadelphia, but not Villanova. So. But it seems like you've written some fantastic books, and I just bought your book on Jim Bouton. Well, tell us how you decided to do a book on him, because there's already Ball 4, and in what directions did you go to? And I have to say, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet. I just got it.
Well, so the idea was, the interesting thing about it was that you're right. So he's written a book which is ostensibly about himself, and so that was always the challenge. Like, once he's done that, so what do I add, right? And so I was very cognizant of that. And so, one thing that, I'm going to head this off at the pass here, because if not, somebody's going to ask me this question, but I'll say it now, that I purposely, people always ask, well, did you speak to this player, this player, this player? And I spoke to some players, but I purposely decided I was not going to do that. I was not going to talk to all of the players who played for the Pilots and the Astros and the Yankees and all that, because that's in Ball 4. I mean, all of that stuff is in Ball 4. I mean, you want to hear, what Steve Hovley thinks today. I'm not sure how interesting that is, but these interesting things about these players, I think most of the stuff is in Ball 4. And so you really don't need me for that. And so I purposely decided I wasn't going to do that. I was going to talk to other people in his life that, now some of them were players, but a lot of them were not players. They were people he grew up with, and people that he was friends with, and people that he did projects with, and people he was in love with, and stuff like that. And so that you get a picture of him as a person rather than him as the character in Ball 4. And really, I think in many ways it's Ball 4 is a very personal book, but he is playing a character in Ball 4, and that comes through pretty clearly. It's a great character, but it's a character, and so my idea was to see if we can get behind that character and see the person.
Mary, you're muted.
Oh.
I don't want the lobby music to come in,
yeah.
So I'm muting myself. So, and anyone who has any questions for Mitch, I guess what would we be surprised to know about Jim Bouton that we wouldn't have gotten from Ball 4? Because it sounds like you've delved further.
Well, one thing that I was surprised, I mean, I don't know what anybody else could be surprised by, but I know one thing that surprised me was how unsure of himself he was. And so the character that comes through in the book is really a kind of a cocky wise ass, and but really he isn't like that, or he wasn't like that at all. And he was always really unsure of himself. And now this is my take on Bouton, and he's called the Bulldog, but my take on that is that was a front that he put up. This idea that he's like this tenacious bulldog, and he's the most competitive and you can't beat him. that's a front. I really am convinced that that was a front, and that was something that he created to help get himself past all of the uncertainty. Because you know, he was not a big guy. He's a little guy, and um, he never looked like a professional athlete. You know, he's a normal looking guy. He's not muscular. He was not big. Um, he was never the best athlete. He was not a bad athlete, but everybody knew a kid like Jim Bouton growing to school. You know, he was a good athlete. Nothing that you would say this guy is going to be a professional athlete, but I think he created this front to cover up all of this insecurity. And I'll tell you one thing that I mentioned this in the book, but it was shocking to me when this was Paula, his wife, said this to me, that when she first they had gone out for a few months or so, and this is in the late 70s, and she wanted to introduce him to her friends, and she wanted him to go out to dinner with her friends or something, and he was resisting. And she finally asked him, why are you resisting? And she kind of thought that it was, well, he's the big shot athlete, he's not going to start, and his answer was, I don't see what about me they would find interesting. I don't know what they would want to talk to me about, what I would talk to them about. Because all her friends were like PhDs. And he's like, I don't see how I could talk to these people. Why would they want to talk to me? And so that's the last thing you would think of a professional athlete. Now, already by this point, he's Jim Bouton, author of Ball 4. I mean, he is a national celebrity at this point. And still he feels like he's not worthy of the company of these people who, really just wanted probably to meet their friend's boyfriend, I guess, at that point.
That's excellent. That's fascinating, I think. So I'm going to open up to I have to say I've been up since 3 a.m. Milwaukee time. I've been traveling, and so I'm going to open it up to questions. So I might not be completely coherent. So and so we can discuss Ball 4. I don't know if anybody has read any of Mitch's books, but Richard, please.
Yeah, Mitchell, just as a quick follow-up to what Mary just asked, and what you're talking about, this unsureness of himself, do you think he always had that? Or because he was like a World Series hero. In a sense, I always thought of him as sort of having these two lives where he comes up, he's very successful at the start. He's actually it looks like this just next wave of Yankee dominance. Like, oh, we got Mike Tresh, we got, or Tom Tresh, I can't think of his name, but we got Tresh, we got Pepitone, we got, here Mel Stottlemyre, we got Jim Bouton. Yeah, it's just another wave. We can all see it coming, and then whoa.
Horace Clarke.
Yeah, do you think the injuries in that played any role of this, or do you think this is just something that transcended that?
You mean the uncertainty?
Yeah.
He had that as a kid. He in fact, I talked to people he grew up with who he said he was always, first of all, he was always a wise ass. And so that's one thing that comes through from everybody I spoke to, is that he was always like that. But that doesn't, again, that could be covering up for something else, right? So, yeah, I mean, he was always like that. He was always one of these kids who never thought he was good enough. And, from Ball 4, he got cut from his high school team and all that stuff. And, the interesting thing that in Ball 4, he talks about that, and he kind of makes a joke of it, calls himself Warm Up Bouton and all that stuff, and which is true. People did call him that, but so he plays it off in the book as kind of a joke. But I spoke to people he played high school ball with, who said that it was not funny for him when that happened, and there were more than a few fights in the locker room started by him because of frustration. He would lash out. He was not happy being Warm Up Bouton. As much fun as he makes it sound like in the book, none of the people I spoke to said that, oh yeah, he was a happy-go-lucky guy about that. He was not. One of the people I spoke to was Jerry Colangelo, who was a teammate of his in high school, and ended up being, basketball executive, with the Phoenix Suns and those places. And Colangelo was the star of those teams in high school, and Bouton was a nobody. And so everybody would come out to see Colangelo pitch. And actually, Colangelo was really the reason why Bouton never pitched, because Colangelo was the star. And so Colangelo said that Bouton had a very difficult time with the fact that he was not, that Colangelo was the star and Bouton wasn't even playing, and so yeah, that was always there.
So Bouton actually was very competitive, even though
Oh, he was always
it
very
it
competitive.
like comes off. He tries to almost pretend he's nonchalanting everything. He's not taking anything, but yet he's actually very competitive. It's just
Yeah, well, he used to. In fact, one of his brothers told me the story about how he got cut when he moved to Chicago Heights, or he went to school in Chicago Heights. He lived in Illinois, Indiana. I don't know. It's a long time since I wrote the book, but anyway, he went to school in Chicago Heights, Bloom High School, Bloom Township High, and he got cut from everything because it was a huge school and it was a feeder school from the whole Chicagoland area. And so you had all sorts of kids coming from all different areas, and there were a lot of really great athletes there. And so he got cut from everything. And he once he got cut from the football team, and he recruited some of his friends, and they would play to play a pickup game against the players who were actually on the team. And according to his brother, who was also part of those games, Bouton took these really seriously, and says he won all those games. I don't, frankly, if I was on the football team, I would look at this as like, well, this is just, it's an afternoon after school, we're fooling around. But that's not how he looked at it. He looked at it like he was proving a point. I think he was proving a point to himself, maybe, but I'm not so sure the football team looked at it like that.
I'm from Chicago, so I can confirm that at least at that time, Bloom was very strong athletically. It's kind of like, it's not the same now, but I mean, that time, 60s and 70s, that was, an elite athletic school, and they were winning state championships in basketball and stuff like that. Really good.
That's how it was portrayed to me. And in fact, one of his coaches told him, that, because it was so tough competitively, he was trying to play everything. He wanted to play football, basketball, and baseball, which is what he had done in New Jersey when he grew up in Jersey, in Ridgewood. He was, well, I don't know if he was a star, but he was a good player, and he played for all of those teams. And this one coach took him aside after he got cut from everything. I think he made the freshman baseball team, and the coach said, you really need to pick one, because everybody here who's playing is elite at what they do. And if you're going to just dabble in this and dabble in that, you're not going to play any of them. But, if you can dedicate yourself to one of them, and I think this guy was the baseball coach, and he said, I would pick baseball. You're not big enough for basketball or football. His coach, by the way, his baseball coach, he was still alive when I was writing the book. I spoke to him. He has since died, but he was a really fascinating guy. He'd been there forever. Yeah, I was surprised to learn that his high school baseball coach was still around, which was really, he and his wife. And Bouton was friendly with both he and his wife and used to go over there. He would eat dinner there and things like that. So he had a relationship with both of them, which I thought was pretty interesting.
I think you described Bouton as being insecure, but in the book, he seemed very self-assured when he would ask for more money and be bargaining with the team. They'd come back with a higher offer and he'd reject it, and they'd go on with that. Do you have any comment regarding that?
Yeah, he could be unsure of himself, but he also was principled, and he knew what he thought he deserved, and he was not shy about asking for it. So yeah, he would stand up for himself. He he always did that. In fact, if you go to the Bouton archives, which you can go to now in Library of Congress, one thing that I found in there, which was really interesting, is the Topps minor league baseball card contract. So they would pay certain minor leaguers. Certain minor leaguers would get a card. The contract was for $5. That's what you got for being on a card. It's supposed to be just for the honor of being a card. He refused to sign the contract because he said the amount was insufficient. And there's a letter in there that goes along with it. His letter back to the Topps people saying that this is unacceptable, and he tried to make a counteroffer, and they just ignored him. But yeah, there you can see the unsigned Topps minor league contract. It's from like 1960, maybe, I think, something like that. So that I think is pretty interesting. So he was always like that. So this goes back to when he's a minor leaguer. He was doing this.
I find it such a dichotomy that that if you aren't this elite athlete, a lot of times a guy like Billy Martin will have that fire, or, there's something that just drives them to no end that they make it. Is, obviously, I guess Bouton probably did have a lot of drive, but do you have a sense what really made him make it, actually?
Well, he did have a lot of drive. I mean, the Bulldog, I say it's a facade, but he was driven. I mean, he really was driven. My point was more that naturally he wasn't that type of a person, but he could transform himself. It's sort of like, you ever hear, like if you watch the Michael Jordan documentary and talked about how he would just create controversies, right? He would create slights. This guy looked at me funny, and so the next game I'm going to go after him. But he's making it up to motivate himself. But it worked, right? I mean, it's a made up slight, but if it motivated him, Jordan, to go out there and just take somebody apart, it worked. That's sort of what Bouton was doing, right? He was not naturally that sort of a person, but he could get himself into that mood or that mode and become that person. And, later in his life, he got into hypnotism, which I thought was really fascinating. It was actually that the idea of it comes from Paula, but he was really doing that. He was sort of hypnotizing himself before he knew her. When he was playing, he could get it. And the way he explained it to me, he was really good in how he explained it. Because, you hear the word hypnotism, it sounds like, booga booga, all that stuff. But he's like, that's not it at all. He said, it's like, you ever hear a ball player say they're in the zone? And he's like, and sometimes a ball player will say that they don't hear the crowd, and they don't even see, a pitcher won't even see the batter. He'll just see, the catcher's mitt. Because that's a form of hypnotism. Right? You train your brain to only focus singularly on whatever it is that your target is. And he said that's what he was doing. He just said, I didn't know that was hypnotism. But, later on, somebody gave it a name, and he's like, oh yeah, I know exactly what that is. And he would use that later in life for pain management. A lot of there's a whole school of thought about using hypnotism as a form of pain management and getting your brain to hyper focus on something other than the pain. And so he was able to do that. Again, hypnotism is not like what you see in the movies where they put you under and you're in a trance. You're not in a trance, but you're just singularly focused on something to the extent that you could block something or everything else out. And that's what he was like. And so that's the Bulldog, right? The Bulldog is a person, this persona that this suit he could put on where he becomes this person, which he is not otherwise this person. But when he's the Bulldog, he really is the Bulldog. I mean, that's not fooling around. He really is that. Just like Jordan is the killer on the basketball court when he's not really. It's sort of the same.
A key part of his makeup, and obviously he's a smart guy. That's got to help too.
Yeah. I mean, he's a very smart guy. Interestingly, he got a reputation as being an intellectual, but he never graduated from college. And he would play on teams with players in the they had all graduated from college, and yet he was, he was the intellectual, because he just thought more about things. And so, yes, they may have graduated from college, but he was like, he would always want to know, well, why does this work? Instead of just, pitching coach says do this, he would respond, well, okay, what is that supposed to do? And can you explain how that works and stuff like that? And to the point where it would annoy the hell out of some people, right? Because they're just used to these athletes just doing it, or not doing it. But very rarely would they get an athlete who would want to know why. What's the rationale behind this? Because he's not going to buy into it unless he understands the rationale, and that would frustrate managers, pitching coaches, teammates. Pretty much everybody in baseball was annoyed by that.
Except maybe.
I apologize if this is a very hypothetical question, but I've thought about it today in anticipation of this session tonight. If Bouton were in his prime now, or around the time he wrote Ball 4, do you believe he would have been very vocal about some of the issues baseball's facing today? So about spin rates and the new rules, or was his focus on his own competitive environment?
Well, you mean, does he have an opinion about those things?
But would he be vocal about it?
I don't
Would
see
he
how he. I don't see how
Would
he
be
can't
Trevor
be.
Bauer or Brandon McCarthy or something, right? I mean,
He would never be Trevor Bauer. We'll get that out of the way. I don't think he can't be vocal. Like he again, this is something I think Paula said to me, which was he just says what's on his mind, not thinking that it's controversial or bizarre or out of, what's the word? Out of turn, perceived to be out of turn. He would just say it, and then he would wonder why people were so shocked by what he said. Now, that's not true 100% of the time. He also was a little bit of a needler and a provocateur, and so yes, he's not naive. He was not naive, but he would also be one of these guys who would just say something because it just seemed natural to him. That, well, doesn't everybody see this? Doesn't everybody see what's going on here? And then when people would respond like, how could you say that? His response would be, how could you not see that? And the truth is, most people see it. It's just they wouldn't say it, and then they would lash out when he would say it. I think, and this is even true up to the end of his life, he would see things and they would just strike him a certain way, and then he couldn't believe that not everybody saw it the same way. And that's good and bad, because everybody has their own perspective, but nobody's right 100% of the time, and so a lot of times he would see things a certain way and say things that I think in retrospect he would realize were wrong, but he just would say it, and that got him into a fair amount of hot water throughout most of his life, because he would see it, and he would do the opposite of what's on the the clubhouse wall. If you see it, say it. That's sort of what he did, and for better or for worse, I guess.
Yeah.
Mitch, hey, thanks for joining. Just piggybacking on that, one of the parts I really liked in your book and knew nothing about was just the career as a sportscaster. And I'm surprised that he made it as long as he did, given sort of your comments. How did he manage to last as long as he did as a sportscaster?
Well, hey, Dan.
Hey.
So yeah, that was interesting. So he seems like a guy who wouldn't fit, right? Like a guy that would just get thrown off the air. But he happened, I think a lot of his success is because of him. But I also think a lot of his success has to do with the fact that he had incredible timing, in that Ball 4 comes out right in the middle of this surge of new journalism and also a lot more rawness in writing. Like Portnoy's Complaint was on the bestseller list the year before Ball 4 comes out. So people were ready for a book like Ball 4, right? So it wasn't like the whole world was, it wasn't like it was 1960 and Ball 4 comes out, which would have just blown people's heads off. The book comes out at a time when people are sort of ready for it. They might not know they were ready for it, but they were. But then also, like when he's a sportscaster, that's right in the beginning of this era of the jock as, the local sports anchor. And so again, he's not the first, right? So it's not like he started it. That really Frank Gifford was, and Kyle Rote were doing it before he was. And there was a handful of other jocks. So he comes into this world where people are already starting to become comfortable with athletes and as, talking heads. And he also happens to come into local news at a time when free-form local news is just starting to hit. Again, he didn't do that, but this, this Eyewitness News and the Happy Talk and the Action News, and every local market has this or had this. It was the anchors bantering with each other, and we know that the weatherman's a good guy, and everybody's like, it's kind of free-form. And what's more perfect for Jim Bouton than free form, and he comes into this world where it's free form. He doesn't want to read the scores, but you know what? No big deal, because it's kind of free form, and he got some pushback, but ultimately they were fine because they liked the banter between him and, the co-anchors. They like that. But I think that the reason he didn't last longer was because that format ended by like the late 70s. It was becoming much more tightly controlled, and the ex-jocks were leaving and being replaced by professional sportscasters who were starting to do the sports. I talk about Sal Marciano in New York, who's still there. But those guys, right? Those guys who are professionals, and then also the 30-minute news. Now you have 4 minutes for sports and 3 minutes for weather and 2 minutes for this and 5 minutes for this. But back then it was like, yeah, Bouton has about 4 minutes, but if he goes 7, we'll deal with it. You couldn't do that once you hit about 1979, 1980, because it was just too regimented. And so at that point he was done. He never could have survived.
Mitchell, Dennis here. Thank you again for showing up. I agree with Dan 100% on that. He was really criticized for the book. He was asked to not publish it by the commissioner and so on and so forth. And I'm hearing he was very unsure of himself, yet he was very driven. How did the criticism that he received from fellow ball players and Major League Baseball in general affect him, considering those different pieces of himself?
Well, I have a whole chapter on that, and about what happened in that time period, because you're right. There's a lot of these different parts are coming together. There's the part where he wants to say what he wants to say, but he's also worried that it's not going to be any good, or that I don't think he's so worried he's going to be ostracized, because at that point he was, as he says in the book, he's already kind of washed up already by the time the 69 season comes around. He's kind of a washed up player, but he was really the initial response. So there's two types of initial response. There's the initial response from the Look excerpts that come out in late May of 70, and that's like a bomb hits baseball. And most of the response to that initially was Dick Young and Bowie Kuhn, and was very negative. And he for that, there was a period of time where he really was worried that he had done something very, I don't say wrong, but he was concerned. His mother called him crying at one point. Not that she didn't. His parents were not prudes, but his mother was concerned that, I think at one point she asked one of her friends, am I going to have to change my last name after this book comes out? And she's not saying that as a joke. I mean, she was worried that, so he was pretty upset. But then it starts to, the reviews start coming in. The look excerpts are just like, and there's a whole story about why those excerpts look the way they do. I don't know if you've read them, but I can talk about that in a second. But the look excerpts is like all the salacious stuff. Everything salacious about Ball 4 is in the first excerpt. But the book is like 400 and something pages, and most of it isn't that. And so the look excerpts is just like, it's everything Greenies and Mickey Mantle being drunk and players kissing on a bus, all this stuff. And so that's like got all the, the Puritans and the inside baseball people, and they're all upset. But then when the reviews of the book starts coming out, and people who have read the book, and also people outside of baseball, like the literati who are not baseball writers, read the book, then it starts to flip. And then he starts getting feedback from most of the fans who love the book. He got some nasty letters here and there, but most of it was pretty positive. And so then he pretty quickly realized that, this is going to go over well. And then even his mother hosted a book party after that initial trepidation. She became very proud of it and would take it with her everywhere, and would talk about it, and try to give copies away to people. So she was at the end, she was very much on board.
Just the thought of doing something that your mother would want her to change your last name put a shudder through me. I'm thinking, oh my God, I hope I never did that.
Yeah, but at the end, she didn't want to change her last name. She was very proud of it. She would walk around with it, and she would go on TV. They say she was on some shows, and she would go on and talk about her son's book, and she was very proud of it, which was really, as you said, it's very surprising after the beginning when she was, again, she's not a prude. She wasn't a prude. She was just very concerned that, all of her friends would think that, her son was this awful person, and she didn't want that.
But just almost by sheer definition, if you did something that made Bowie Kuhn angry, hadn't you achieved something in life? Like, just my natural instinct is he didn't like it. My God, that's good. That's an accomplishment.
That's the George Costanza approach.
Yeah, the opposite.
Right? Yeah.
Hey Mitchell, I got a question for you about. I feel like the book is like both a product of its time and timeless. And I know, like, the first time I read the book, PEDs were, a big conversation everybody was having. Now I've read the book, and some of the stuff about the national anthem kind of stood out. I'm kind of curious to see, like, from the first time you read his book to now, how has your interpretation of it changed, or what things have brought to the surface that kind of have evolved along with the sport and culture?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I first read the book during the baseball strike in 1981. And so I was 15, and I was a huge baseball fan, and there was no baseball. And I was aware of Ball 4, but I had obviously never read it. And I was like, well, that was a good time to read Ball 4. And I loved it. I mean, 15 years old, that's like the perfect age to read that book. I got plenty of curse words, and there's some sex in it, and it's, and it's baseball. So it's like, if a robot were to create a perfect book for me, it would be that book, right? But the interesting thing about that book is when I read it. Okay, so I read the book at 15 during the players' strike, and I was reading it to kind of rekindle this association with baseball that I was missing because there were no games. But I found that I was learning 11 years after the book had come out why there was no baseball, right? Because if you read the book, you can really understand all of the labor stuff that I was in the middle of 11 years later. And it was like, wow, I didn't understand any of it. I was certainly no expert on it, even though I finished Ball 4, but I had an understanding of, oh, this is why they're asking for this, and this is why this bothers them. And I remember I was upset there was no baseball when they went on strike, but I also remember that by the end of reading Ball 4, I was 100% on the player's side, on the player's strike. In fact, was it a strike or a lockout? I'm not sure. I keep calling it a strike, but I think it may have been a lockout.
It was a player's strike.
It was okay. So yeah, 72 was the lockout. Yeah, I was really firmly on their side at the end of it. And then, so I've read it now. I don't know how many times I've read that book. I read it a lot. And as I got older, I would see there were different parts of that book that just would stand out to me that maybe didn't stand out before. So when I'm 15, the part about him trying to hang on is not, it's a plot point.
Yeah.
Yeah. But when you're older, you start to really understand that, and you start to really see that perspective, and kind of going through a change in your life, and you're going to leave this part of your life and you don't want to leave it. And, you do what you can not to, let it go. Casey, the dog, wants to go out. But yeah, so like that, those things come up later. And so, and then there's also that stuff, the postscripts, the addendums from 1980, 81 or something. And, the ones every 10 years he would have. And so you see more and more about him as an older person. And as I become an older person, I see more, I see more of myself I recognize some of those thoughts, at least. I'm not saying I'm like Jim Bouton, but I recognize some of those thoughts. So let me just let my dog out. Hold on one second.
I guess, Jack, to follow up on your question, did anybody else have that same experience?
All right.
I read it 30, 40 years ago compared to now. Did anybody else have that same experience that Mitch is talking about?
Well, I'm going to shift it up here a little, just because I think you talk about it in your book. I still have to get your book, Nick Mitchell, but I'm looking forward to it, reading it. But as a kid, maybe slightly younger than you were when you read Ball 4, as a kid, I read Jim Brosnan's Pennant Race, and I was blown away by that. I mean, that was, even comparison to the other type of books I had read about baseball. Yeah, it's not as salacious, but it's still a very different experience. And so when I got around to Ball 4 later, already I was old enough that I could notice the different, this aspect of aging that had crept in, and that, like you said, almost a desperation to get this knuckleball to work. It's always there in the book, but if you're young, you're not going to notice that it's there. He's writing about it, but he's disguising it that, there's this sense of desperation he has. But have you read, well, I mean, the one Brosnan's known for is Long Season. So of course I've never read that. I've read Pennant Race, but I love Pennant Race.
I think I read both of them. I read Long Season a couple of times.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've read the other one. I read Pennant Race once a while ago. I love those books. I think those books are great.
Brosnan didn't like Ball 4. I mean, he felt like it was a kind of a low-level version of what he himself had done 10 years earlier. I don't know if he ever changed his mind about that, but when it came out, he was, he wasn't like, I never read this thing, but I hate it. It wasn't anything like that. He just felt it was, too revealing of stuff, I guess.
Yeah, and when Bouton was doing the press for Ball 4, he was, it was kind of a rivalry. I don't know who started it, but I know that Bouton really kind of ripped Brosnan when he was doing the press for Ball 4, kind of saying, well, that's a martini drinker's view of of baseball, and I'm going to give you the beer slosher's view, which is interesting because Bouton didn't drink beer.
Yeah.
And Bouton was hardly a beer slosher. And but I read a lot of stuff that Bouton had said while he's promoting Ball 4, and of course the immediate comparison is always going to be to Brosnan's book, and so he was asked about it a lot, and he was very dismissive of it, although later he would say that he liked it. So I just wonder, I don't know if he really, I suspect he liked it, but I think that bulldog is coming out right there, and competitive nature, and he's going to tear down what he sees as the competitor. I thought some of the stuff he said about Brosnan, I thought was a little rough, and that, there's room for more than one really good book on the inside life of baseball.
The long season is a classic. If you have read that, go read it. But I think by the time Bowden's book came out, the long season just was kind of dated. People were ready for more, just like we've been saying all night. And Bowden sure delivered. But even though there were, I heard a recent interview with Bobby Richardson, who said he really hated the book, but this was a guy who was trailed by detectives after going out to get a milkshake and playing basketball at the YMCA.
Yeah, Richardson. I spoke to Bobby Richardson. He didn't want to talk to me for the book, but I did have a conversation with him about Bouton, which Richardson told me was off the record, and I was not to quote him or anything, but he really did not like Jim Bouton at all, and sort of gave me. He's a very nice guy, Bobby Richardson. He's like the most gentlemanly person. It was the most gentlemanly kiss off I had ever received. He was very nice, and you couldn't dislike him really at the end. The guy gave me like a 20-minute lecture about why everything about Jim Bouton is awful, but in the most pleasant way possible, that by the end I was like, oh yeah, you're definitely, yes, you're right. And then I'm like, no, you're not. But just a really nice guy. He just doesn't like Jim Bouton. And obviously they're very different backgrounds, and it's too bad that I couldn't use him in the book, because I really thought that a lot of the stuff he said to me was really interesting stuff. I couldn't use it, but he has a very interesting perspective, the diametrically opposite perspective, and he's very well spoken, and yeah, I wish I could have used it, because I thought it would have been really, I think, illuminating as to why some players didn't like him. And Richardson was a very good mouthpiece for that, but you didn't want me to use it, so didn't use it.
Mitch, later in life,
I'm sorry.
Sorry, you're kind of hearing Bouton in the news, Big League Chew, and then the sports casting, and then the minor league team, and just he's doing all this stuff. He lives 50 years after Ball 4, and I'm just wondering, when you say he was insecure, mostly you've referred to kind of his earlier life. I wonder if you felt that as he got older, he changed in some ways, or if it was always a recognizable Bouton just growing older and being himself.
Well, I mean that the anecdote I said about going out with his girlfriend's friends, that's from the late 70s. So that's post Ball 4. He had a very difficult time in the 70s and 80s. And that's when he was most famous, right? This is Big League Chew time, and he's a sportscaster. He's a best-selling author, international provocateur. As he told me one time, anytime somebody, anytime somebody wants a counterpoint or a sports-related item, they call me. And I'm supposed to be the one to give the other side. And so eventually he stopped taking those calls. But he had a very difficult time during that period because I think he was still, he had a lot of internal issues in terms of what he felt his worth was. And I think a lot of that stuff that got expressed externally, particularly, like, I don't know if you can see on YouTube, there's a clip of him on the Tonight Show with Carson, and this is late 70s. He comes out in an all white suit, and he's just like Mr. Cool, but the turmoil that's going on in his life that night is just like out of control. His marriage is falling apart. He's there with his girlfriend, and you know, a lot of this is just this affront that he's putting up. And hold on, I'm gonna let the dog back in. Hold on.
What goes out must come back in, I guess.
The pup comes first. I'm sorry, I'm this disembodied voice. I'm trying to find quiet. And
Dog wants
I'm
what
in
the
this
dog
little
wants.
theater.
Yes, the dog wants what the dog wants.
Yeah.
He knows none of the other things. But sorry. But like, a lot of this stuff is just it is sort of low self-esteem. You know, him putting himself out there like that, and it comes off as he's a big shot. But I think a lot of this stuff is more of him really not seeing value in himself. And I know I'm psychoanalyzing the guy, but I spoke to a lot of people, and this was the common thread through everybody who knew him during that period of time, said some version of the same thing, that he was really in a bad place because he wasn't a ball player anymore, and he didn't really feel he had much worth if he couldn't be, you know, on top of the news, you know. And so that's why he would do a lot of things to keep himself out there, because if he wasn't out there, I think from what people told me, he didn't really think there was a value there, and that didn't resolve until really the end of his life. I think by the time you get to even that was true in the late 90s too. I think it takes till like the last, like maybe the 2000s, until he becomes a little more comfortable with himself. But that's a lifelong journey. That's not, you know, it doesn't go. That goes back to one of the first things that I mentioned about, like, what's the most surprising thing, which was that you know, I would never have thought that this guy, every time I saw this guy on TV, he was just a swaggering guy, you know. I mean, he's a good-looking guy. He's famous, successful, and like everything he does, he's successful. I mean, who is, you know, who do you know who's like that, you know? And yet the guy internally is a mess. I mean, just a real mess. And it was surprising.
I don't know how many people among us were at the 2006 SABR convention in Seattle, but Bouton was there. I think, yes, Richard, I think he gave the keynote address there. And I thought there, when I heard he was going to be there, I thought, well, this is going to be interesting, you know. And but he seemed through the entire weekend to thoroughly enjoy himself, I thought, in that SABR setting. And of course, then he was at the 2017 after declining a bit. But I thought in Seattle, he seemed very cordial and friendly to everybody, and he seemed to really have a good time.
Well, I think he realized he had a welcoming audience, that this wasn't your typical crowd. People knew who he was, and why, you know, he didn't have to like put that out there. You know, these are people familiar with his book, who loved his book, and you know, just wanted to hear more. You know, it was like, hey, you know, that's like, hey, okay, you got edited down. What was edited? We want to hear it.
Yeah, you can if you want to read the whole unedited version, that's also in the Library of Congress. The original version is about 3 times as long as the other. I will tell you that what was edited out should have been edited out. So what we ended up with at the end, that's the version you want. Yeah. You don't want that other stuff. A lot of it is really not that interesting. It's just a lot of, you know, but wasn't the 2006 SABR convention? I spoke to some people who were there. There was a whole thing with vintage baseball. That was it. I think it was at the SABR convention.
In Seattle. Yes.
Yeah. And so I spoke to some people, because he was getting involved in vintage baseball then. And so he started up a new league. And there was I have a chapter of it in my book, which I thought was really interesting. I didn't know this at all. I'm not a vintage baseball person, but he was starting up a new league, a vintage baseball league, and the vintage baseball purists hated him because he had said that he was going to take cherry pick some rules from the 1861 game and the 1863 game and the 1871 game and put them together and make this thing. And they could not have hated that more. And so, but of course, as John Thorne said, and it's like, well, it wasn't like they changed the rules every year completely. All these different leagues, they all had an amalgam of rules, and what Bouton was doing wasn't really all that different than what you would have found at that period. If you were watching vintage baseball in 1870, not vintage baseball, you were watching early baseball in the late 19th century, for most leagues outside of the National League, you would have seen what they were recreating. You would see some leagues did this and some leagues did that, and some had a combination, and it wasn't pure as you're seeing in the recreations. And so, but there was this whole confrontation as it was described to me. And everybody on the vintage baseball side who I spoke to, who again didn't like Bouton and hated this idea, they all agreed on one thing: that Bouton turned that room around, so that by the end everybody was on his side. And he's like, with one guy I said, was like, I don't understand it. I'm at a SABR convention. I'm all about the purity of the game. And I thought, this is my audience. And it took Bouton about 20 minutes to turn everybody against me. And they were all on his side. And from what these people were telling me, it's like, he had everybody in that room eating out of his hand. And he let one of the guys, like, I knew we were cooked. There's no way to defeat a guy like that, who was just so personable and just so good at disarming people.
Yes, I know. I remember that he was very humorous in his talk. He had a lot of laughter, and that's my recollection of it. And also a recollection I personally had was I was in the elevator with him at the time one time, and a couple of other people, and how just friendly he was in talking to everybody, asking us where we were from and things like that. And it really wasn't the kind of I guess at the time I thought he might be more self-absorbed than he was that week.
No, that was. I'll second that. It was a good experience, and I mean, I think he enjoyed it, but I know we enjoyed having him there.
Even the people, like all these vintage baseball people who, again, really just to this day, disagree with the whole approach of that league that again didn't last more than a few years, but they all came away saying, he still is a good guy, and they didn't like what he was doing, and they may not even have liked him, but they all agreed that it was hard not to end up somewhere on his side because he was just such a personable guy. And he's not coming from a bad place. He's not coming from a place where he's looking to ruin you. He's just, he thinks this is a better way of going. And again, it's not like he's out to tear these people down. He's just, I think a lot of them took it as a personal affront that he was cherry picking the rules, in their eyes, at least. But at the end, none of it was hard to find. I mean, I talked to people who had really bad endings with him, really bad, like the lawyers got involved, and even them were like, well, you know what, except for that part, he was a really fun guy to be with. Until we had to bring the lawyers in, he was really a fun guy, and it was interesting. Bouton ripped off one guy he was writing a book with, and I mean, it was bad. This is many, many years ago, but even that guy was like, oh, he was so much fun to be with. Yes, it ended terribly, and we had to call the lawyers in and threaten to sue him, and then, so whatever. But he says, but it still was a lot of fun. And I'm glad I had my time with him.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
even his first wife is like that, and that was an ugly divorce. But even she was like, and I asked her this, and she said, I really enjoyed my marriage. It ended horribly, but I feel like I got the best of Jim Bouton at the best time of his life. And she, there was some things that went on in their marriage which were pretty rough on her, and and she acknowledged all of that, but she said, but still, he was genuinely a good guy, even though he did some real crappy things. I'm not dismissing the crappy things, but and she's not dismissing the crappy things. And even he didn't dismiss the crappy things. He eventually was able to realize that a lot of this stuff was not right. But yeah, but even her was like, even with all that.
So Mitchell, what, totally changing the subject here. Did you find, what
Thanks,
was
Bob.
Bouton's experience on making Long Goodbye with Robert Altman? Did he have anything? Was there anything? Did you find out anything about that? Because it's a fascinating film, and just, the counter casting throughout that whole movie, Nita von Palitz and all of this just bizarre casting. It's kind of fun and weird as a result.
Yeah. So yeah, I wrote a little bit about that and how he was friends with Elliot Gould because they were doing some anti-war speaking, and that's how he met Elliot Gould. He met him in I think in Washington Square Park one day, where they were at an anti-war protest, and so he became friends with Elliot Gould. And then I can't remember the name of the actor who was supposed to have Bouton's role, but he got sick. I wrote, it's in the book, but I can't remember off the top of my head who it was. But whoever it was got sick, and Elliot Gould called him in the middle of the night, because Elliot Gould's out in California and Bouton's in New York. And he says, hey, you want to be in a Robert Altman movie? Bouton's like, okay. And he's like, all right, pack a toothbrush, be here tomorrow morning. And so he gets there, and Robert Altman spoke to him, and he's like, all right, you'll be fine. And he said it was a weird experience in that he didn't, they gave him a script. He read the script, and then Altman took the script and said, forget the script.
Yeah.
And he just had them talk. And Altman just filmed the whole thing and threw 99% of it away, but then was able to get, because Elliot Gould, according to Bouton, Elliot Gould knew exactly what he was doing, and so Elliot Gould knew where to go with the scene.
Yeah.
There's with the cat and the cat food and all that stuff in the beginning, where because he's in some apartment building in California, and so Elliot Gould was like leading him into certain conversations, and so Bouton would go there, but of course Bouton would always kind of step out of his role and become Jim Bouton again, and so but Altman got enough of it, and then he's only in that scene, and then he's at the end. He's he gets shot at the end of the movie. Spoiler alert! Too late, but the movie's been out for half a century, so
no, it's very,
that's on you.
No, it's very effective though, because one of the reasons I was thinking of what you were just describing is, all these people who had met him, describe Bouton as like, well, you had a bad dealing with him, but you still liked him. And it's kind of like that really describes his character in the film, who's kind of like, even though you see it there, it's like he at the start of the film, if you haven't seen it, he comes in and he asks Marlowe to help him with something. And he's kind of like, Marlowe senses he's not on the level, but yet he's likable. Marlowe still likes him. And so it kicks off everything that goes on in the film. And it's effective because as a mystery story, it's like, he's like the last person you'd suspect who's really behind a lot of stuff going on. That's what made it sort of so, and then, when he gets shot at the end, it's shocking because you're not expecting him. It's just like, he's too likable. Come on, you're not going to shoot him. That's kind of what really made it effective.
Yeah, and then he ended up getting sick from being in that water for like hours at a time. He ended up getting like a stomach virus, which it took him weeks to get rid of. Because, you know, he was like, because you remember that scene, he gets shot and he falls into the, he falls into that pool of water. And it's like, he was apparently spent the whole day in that water and ended up with a stomach virus or a bug or something. But it was weeks. He was sick for weeks apparently after that. But anyway, he said it was a lot of fun. And, you know, if you saw the Ball 4 TV show, you see he's not a great actor.
No.
but it works in the movie. I think because Robert Altman knows how to get something out of you. And in the TV show, it's just it's you know, it's a nightmare to watch him in that TV show. He's pretty bad. And you know, but I think that's testament to all the people who were working around him in the movie that were not there for the TV show.
Yeah, well, I mean, and you know, once again in that film, another example is Nita von Pollitt, who's not an actress by any means, who's beautiful, and that's all Altman really wanted her for. She's like this beautiful image, and you know, he doesn't have her talk too much. She doesn't say too much. She's there, but it pushes the story forward, and it kind of makes sense of some people's motivations for what's going on. It kind of makes a lot of stuff believable, even though, once again, you've got a non-professional in there, who's,
right? You
know, in a spot. So you know.
Yeah. By the way, they're trying to revamp that Ball 4 TV show. Ron Shelton is writing the pilot. So, you know, whether that ever sees the light of day remains to be seen, but it could be interesting if Ron Shelton's going to do it.
Richard, what was the name of that movie again?
The Long Goodbye. It's a Raymond Chandler novel. And so Raymond Chandler wrote like a lot of the ones you'd see Bogart in, The Big Sleep. So very famous mystery writer of the 40s, and it was his last novel, and Altman adapted it with Elliot Gould as kind of a completely different type. You know, it's like an anti-version of Philip Marlowe, just in terms of, you know, but they said it's still very principled man who, you know, one critic described it as if this principled man was asleep for 30 years from the 40s, and he wakes up in the 70s and he's just lost.
Well, you know, he actually, I think he actually is from the 40s. He drives like a car from the 40s in that movie. And he dresses like he's from the 40s. And meanwhile, he's in the middle of, you know, 1970s California.
Yeah, 1970s opens up.
And there are hippies. Yeah, there are hippies.
There's hippies there. Right. They're nude. They're smoking.
There's nude hippies who are down the hall from him, and he passes them, and he just can't he can't. It's like his mind is like he can't comprehend.
Okay with me. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Whatever. Yeah.
Right.
You got to get into it, but I mean, once I think it helps to have an appreciation of all the other Marlowe books and that to appreciate what's going on here, because it's really like a counter thing going on. And then there are some real actors in the film that are used very effectively. So, yeah. And then you've got this like thing that might be partially publicity, but, you know, here's Jim Bouton, who's kind of like, you know, a character in society who's, you know, got the reputation. Here's Nita von Pollitt, was Howard Hughes or
what? She ended up being like a princess or something, like in Iceland or something.
Yeah, but I mean, her fame was because was she Clifford Irving's girlfriend, or
she may have been Clifford? Yes, Clifford Irving.
Clifford Irving's girlfriend, and Clifford Irving wrote the book about Howard Hughes. Right. So it's like that whole thing was in the news, kind of semi-scandalous. And that's how she ended up getting a part in this, just because it's like, oh, it would be like if you were to go now and find, you know, if you were making a film and you were picking people just for shock value, who might like, you know, whatever your political ramifications, you know, but like you were, you know, I'm going to get somebody who I know is going to have shock power here that like, let's get Jeffrey Epstein in here just to throw it in there, just to like shock the audience. Oh, how could you use that person? And it was like, and he had a few people in the film like that. And then it was mixed with, you know, real actors. And Altman had this style of doing entire improv, as Mitchell was suggesting, where he just, you know, like the basic idea of a story, but then it was just going to be the people talking to themselves, and he'd figure out how to make that into the story because he felt that would make it more real and makes it, you know, it's the type of film that's it's dry in some scenes, but good God, I mean, the ending is spectacular. It's a spectacular ending. It's where, you know, if you try to sludge through it and you stay through the ending is just
Yeah, no need to watch it now. I just told you what happened. So
yeah, but well,
save yourself 2 hours at this point.
Yeah.
So we're getting to an hour, so I don't want to keep Mitchell too long. I just want, Bob, can you show us what you showed?
Yeah.
Before we go.
See if I can.
There it is.
The
Seattle
convention program from 2006. And if I can.
There it is. Yeah, we saw
how to show this. It's
signature.
Autographed by Jim Bouton.
Yeah. Yeah.
There it is.
Yep. Yeah, he signed a lot of autographs. He was like
Yes, he did.
very friendly.
Yep.
That's very cool.
Very entertaining.
So Mitchell, I don't want to keep you, Mitch, I don't want to keep you too long. You're welcome. We'll kind of keep talking like we're at a bar somewhere. So you're welcome to.
Yeah, I gotta head off because I got my phone has been ringing off the hook.
Okay, yeah.
So I think somebody's trying to get me. So
thank you so much for your time, and also you wrote a big book on Dick Allen, which I want to read. So that's got to be fast. Oh my gosh, this was fascinating tonight. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really had a good time. It was a lot of
some
fun.
really great insight. Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Thank you, Mitchell. I write a lot of notes on these things because I do the newsletter. And the top of the note says, buy Nathanson's book. So,
yes.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, have a good one.
You bet.
Take care, Mitch. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, I thought that was some great stuff. You know.
Yes. Excellent.
Yeah. So you know, just the idea of the, you know, that he kind of broke the sanctity of the clubhouse, was that really the biggest thing?
Yeah.
I mean, right? Or yeah.
Because this was like a lot, I mean, in a sense, and it wasn't just sports, it transcended. It was like there was a lot of stuff that sort of before the late 60s you never talked about, like, you know, a lot of the reporters with President Kennedy knew damn well he was having affairs all over the place. And that just didn't come out, you know, that didn't come out until like afterwards, once we were in the new generation, it was like, oh, by the way, we knew all this stuff about it, but, you know, it was just accepted that, you know, you would cover it up. It was just, you know, assumed,
right.
You know.
Like Mitch said, you know, it's the right book for the right time. You know, there was a lot of realism coming out in movies, and I think that's why a lot of people embraced it. You know. Well, so, any other thoughts on the book?
I read it a year ago, so I didn't read it now. And what I recall from reading it was the book wasn't as shocking. And maybe because I was older or what, because I read that book, you know, 30, 40 years, it seems forever ago. And so it wasn't as shocking. And I didn't realize with the aging process, I noticed that more, but didn't realize that I did not recall that I did not realize that earlier. I thought that was a very interesting observation.
Yeah. And like Mitchell said, you know, it was like the shocking parts were pulled by a magazine and deliberately highlighted, like, wow, look what's in this book. So it would sell the book, which it ended up doing because, yeah, if Billy Kuhn's going to criticize it, that actually helped with sales, it turned out. And, but, you know, if you actually go through the book, you find out, no, a lot of it's much more mundane that he's talking about. And in that sense, much more like Pennant Race. And I like Pennant Race. So when I read Ball 4, it's like, even without knowing the history of Ball 4, as far as that it was, or, there was this origin that Bouton was aware of the book, and they were somewhat using Long Season and Pennant Race as a framework a little bit. It came through that a lot of that was there. Just the day to day, what it's like being in the bullpen, what players talk about and just what's going on. And, a lot of it wasn't shocking. A lot of it was just mundane stuff that goes on. So
another memory I have from when Ball 4 came out was, and I think it probably spurred even more interest in the book, was Tony Kubek was one of the commentators on the NBC Game of the Week, and he was very outspoken about how he didn't have any respect for it, the book or Bouton, and I remember he carried on about that, about every week on the NBC Game of the Week, and that's one thing I remember was how much Kubek was against it, and on national television, and particularly the parts relating to Mickey Mantle.
Yeah, and and I think, I don't know, like you say, to some degree, you could say that, well, Bouton was a rat per se, but like the players on his team, on the Seattle team, they sort of knew he was doing this. So I don't know if you got that vitriol from the actual players on that team. Mm-hmm. It was the fact that he was incorporating memories of, here's what's going on with the Yankees. And whatever was going on there, I think the Yankee players were sort of like, this is in the past, it's in a cocoon that nobody's ever going to talk about. And I think they felt betrayed. I think they felt like, this was going on, and there was tacit understanding that this wouldn't be talked about. And I think there was definitely a part of that they felt an implicit contract had been broken by him.
It wasn't just the Yankees. It was like Pete Rose, kind of yelling at Bouton, F you, Shakespeare, which I think is kind of funny, but
it is funny.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what's it?
I said it is funny.
It is.
Well,
I thought it was great.
Knowing what everybody knows about Pete Rose, he probably never read a book in his life.
Yeah.
Referring to Shakespeare is perfect.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have anything for show and tell or any other comments? You already had your show and tell, Bob, but we'd like to hear what you have to say.
Let's see if I can hold it up again.
That is very cool.
Upside down.
It's upside down.
I know.
Upside down. Oh, easier to see though. So
it's backwards.
Yeah, I've got.
There it is.
Excellent.
Yeah, I got a signature on a hardcover book, hardcover used book that's buried in my book collection. So the only Bouton book I had available, the only version I had available was the cheap paperback that the one I actually read. So I've had this for years.
So I read the newer version. I was going to ask all of you, have any of you read where he goes 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later?
No, I mean, that's the part that'd be interesting to.
Oh, it's great stuff because, you guys were talking about how, the book strikes you a different way depending on your age and going back to it later. And if you can imagine just seeing his thoughts, going, years later, and just really, fun stuff. Like he was talking about how he thought the players of today were actually a lot better shape. And he's like, yeah, we did all the little stuff great. So if we played, hypothetical game against the modern day players, we'd lose 14-3. We'd get 3 runs doing all the little things, and they would bang out 14 runs on home runs. But it's just really great stuff. I really recommend the more modern version of the book.
I've got a show and tell item here that'll bring back memories to people from Milwaukee. This was the giveaway that you had at the 2001 convention of Milwaukee County Stadium.
Oh, I have one of those. Yeah.
Yeah, it's snowing in the little thing. It's St. Michael Hospital's name is also on the back. But
That's great.
I wonder what happened to mine.
Pardon? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I know that was when the week I met Bob Beege in person.
Great. It was a momentous weekend.
That's right.
Bob was our leader of that convention. It was
Yeah.
one week of a convention, and that's really how this chapter formed. Bob got a bunch of a motley crew of us together to put this convention together, and we like each other so much we thought, let's do a chapter. We kind of did it backwards because normally you had to have a chapter to get a convention, but Bob did some arm twisting or something and got the convention in Milwaukee.
We had some good helpers.
Yeah.
Like yourself.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, I'd almost say that's the first convention I was at. It actually was the second but there had been a long gap for me because the first convention I actually attended they had one in Chicago in '86, and I actually did go to that, but then I didn't go to another convention until your convention, which was, so
Yeah.
it was, I didn't realize you guys didn't have a chapter then. Wow.
Hey guys, before we
There was a meeting of about 5 people.
go on to chatting about other stuff, Mary, do you want to do a thank you on the book club, and then I'll end the recording and we can cover
Absolutely. I want to see if I can show, you probably won't see this. The Brewers fans will like this. This is a ticket to, let's see, Game 6 of the 2003 NLCS. The Marlins, the day that'll live in Cubs infamy. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm in the dark. I'll show it another time. It's the Bartman game.
Ah,
Your face
really?
is real bright, so if you
I
back
know.
it up to your face.
I'm in this little theater because there's like disco music out in the lobby. So, but
Hey,
I'll
Mary,
move.
Mary, I was gonna tell you, I got a new background here, but I recently moved, and now I live about a little more than half a mile southwest of Wrigley. So now I have to put up with all the Cubs fans in my neighborhood everywhere I go, especially after the games. But I make sure to wear my Brewers cap all the time.
well, it's going to be rocking and rolling there tomorrow.
That sounds like a dream. I mean,
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You can hear the crowd cheering for if there's a big play or something like that.
Well, thank you everybody for joining the book club. We've got meetings coming up in July, 2 different meetings scheduled. So hope the newsletter has that. And so thank you everybody. I'm going to turn off the recording for now. And, have a good evening.
thank you everyone